The rain fell steadily against the tall windows of the Cascade Grand Hotel, each droplet tracing silver paths down the glass like tears on an aging face. Inside the opulent lobby, crystal chandeliers cast warm light across marble floors that had witnessed decades of secrets, celebrations, and now one of the most perplexing mysteries Portland had ever seen. Detective Harrison Wells stood before the ornate mahogany desk where the hotel manager nervously shuffled through paperwork, his hands trembling slightly as he recounted the impossible. Behind them, the soft murmur of concerned voices filled the air as guests and staff gathered in small clusters, whispering about what had happened in the early hours of that October morning. The Cascade Grand had been Portland's crown jewel since the 1920s, a testament to elegance and sophistication that attracted wealthy travelers from across the country. Its reputation was built not just on luxury, but on absolute discretion and security. The hotel's vault, located in the basement level, was considered impenetrable until now. Eleanor Blackwood had arrived at the hotel 3 days earlier, stepping out of a silver Bentley with the grace of someone accustomed to attention. At 62, she carried herself with the poise of old money, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her designer dress speaking of wealth that spanned generations. She was traveling alone, which wasn't unusual for a woman of her independence, but what made her stay memorable was the necklace. The Midnight Rose, as it had been known in auction circles, was worth $1.2 million. Crafted in 1897 by a master jeweler in Paris, it featured a centerpiece sapphire the size of a robin's egg, surrounded by diamonds that caught light like captured stars. Eleanor wore it only on special occasions, and her visit to Portland was indeed special. She was meeting with potential buyers, planning to sell the family heirloom to fund a children's charity she had been passionate about for decades. Hotel manager Frederick Caldwell had personally assured her of the vault's security when she requested to store the necklace overnight. The vault was accessible to only 3 people: himself, assistant manager Victoria Hartwell, and head of security Marcus Fleming. Each possessed a unique key, and hotel policy required 2 of the 3 to be present for any opening. The system had worked flawlessly for over 30 years. Eleanor had seemed at ease that evening, dining alone in the hotel restaurant while reading correspondence. Other guests remembered her quiet elegance, the way she thanked the waitstaff with genuine warmth. She retired to her suite on the 15th floor just after 10, content in the knowledge that her precious necklace rested safely below. The discovery came at 7 in the morning, when Eleanor requested access to retrieve the necklace for her appointment with the potential buyers. Frederick and Victoria descended to the vault together, following protocol exactly as they had countless times before. The heavy steel door opened with its familiar mechanical precision, revealing rows of safety deposit boxes and the special secure compartment reserved for items of extraordinary value. The compartment stood empty. Victoria's sharp intake of breath echoed in the small chamber as Frederick stared at the vacant space where a custom velvet box should have been sitting. They searched frantically, checking every corner, every possible location where the necklace might have been misplaced. But deep down, both knew the truth that neither wanted to voice. The Midnight Rose had vanished. What followed was a careful, methodical investigation that would consume the next several months and leave more questions than answers. Detective Wells had seen his share of theft cases, but this one defied logic from the very beginning. There were no signs of forced entry, no damage to the vault door or its sophisticated locking mechanism. The security cameras positioned throughout the basement hallway showed no unusual activity during the night hours. Eleanor took the news with remarkable composure, though those close to her noticed the way her hands shook slightly as she poured her morning tea. The necklace wasn't just valuable in monetary terms, it had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who had worn it to 3 presidential inaugurations and countless society galas. Eleanor had planned to use the sale proceeds to build a new wing for the children's hospital that bore her family name. As investigators delved deeper into the hotel's security protocols, troubling details began to emerge. Frederick Caldwell had managed the Cascade Grand for 12 years, building a reputation for discretion that made the hotel a favorite among Portland's elite. Yet under scrutiny, his perfect record revealed small cracks. There had been minor discrepancies in inventory, nothing significant enough to raise alarms, but patterns that suggested a casual attitude toward the strict procedures that supposedly governed the vault. Victoria Hartwell presented a more complex picture. At 34, she had worked her way up from front desk clerk to assistant manager through dedication and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Colleagues described her as ambitious but fair, someone who genuinely cared about the hotel's reputation. She had access to the vault, but she also had the most to lose from any scandal that might damage the Cascade Grand standing. Marcus Fleming, the head of security, was perhaps the most intriguing of the three. A former police officer who had joined the hotel staff 5 years earlier, he brought law enforcement experience to a position that had previously been filled by retired military personnel. His background check had been impeccable, his references glowing. Yet something about his demeanor during questioning struck Detective Wells as rehearsed, as if Fleming had anticipated these very conversations. The investigation revealed the first major flaw in the hotel's supposedly foolproof system when a locksmith examined the vault mechanism. While the keys were indeed unique, the locks themselves showed signs of having been accessed more frequently than the official logs indicated. More disturbing was the discovery that duplicate keys could theoretically be made, despite assurances that the originals were impossible to copy. Guest records from the previous week painted a picture of the hotel's usual clientele: business travelers, wealthy tourists, and a handful of long-term residents who had made the Cascade Grand their permanent home. Among them was Thomas Whitmore, an antique dealer who had been staying in the hotel for nearly a month while conducting business in the city. His room was just 2 floors above Eleanor's, and hotel staff remembered him asking detailed questions about the building's history and architecture. There was also Margaret Sullivan, a jewelry appraiser who had coincidentally checked in the day before Eleanor's arrival. She claimed to be in Portland for estate evaluations, but investigators found it curious that someone in her profession would be present during the theft of such a significant piece. When questioned, Margaret provided detailed documentation of her business activities, yet something about her explanations felt too convenient, too perfectly aligned with innocent intent. As October gave way to November, the case began to consume everyone it touched. Eleanor extended her stay indefinitely, unwilling to leave Portland while the investigation continued. She could be seen each morning in the hotel lounge, reading newspapers, and occasionally speaking with Detective Wells when he came to interview staff members yet again. The hotel itself seemed to change under the weight of suspicion. Guests whispered in hallways, staff members watched each other with newly suspicious eyes, and the atmosphere of elegant refinement gave way to something more guarded and tense. Reservations began to cancel as word of the theft spread through Portland's social circles. Frederick found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the people he worked with daily. Victoria's efficiency now seemed calculating rather than admirable. Marcus's calm professionalism felt cold and distant. Even long-time employees who had no access to the vault became subjects of his scrutiny, as he wondered what other secrets might be hidden within the hotel's walls. Victoria, meanwhile, threw herself into cooperating with the investigation with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She provided detailed schedules, cross-referenced staff movements, and even volunteered to take a polygraph examination. Her dedication to clearing the hotel's name was admirable, yet it also raised questions about whether someone truly innocent would feel such pressure to prove it. The most puzzling aspect of the case remained the complete absence of the necklace itself. In most theft cases, stolen items eventually surfaced, either through attempts to sell them or through informants within criminal networks. The Midnight Rose, however, seemed to have vanished as completely as if it had never existed. No auction houses reported being approached about similar pieces, no insurance investigators had heard whispers from their usual sources. Detective Wells found himself returning again and again to the fundamental question that had troubled him from the beginning. How does a necklace worth over $1 million simply disappear from what should have been an impregnable vault? The answer, he suspected, lay not in the sophisticated security measures that had failed, but in the human elements that no system could fully account for. As winter approached and the case showed no signs of resolution, the theft of the Midnight Rose had become more than just a crime. It was a puzzle that challenged assumptions about trust, security, and the hidden depths of human nature that could remain concealed beneath years of apparent respectability. The rain continued to fall against the hotel windows, and somewhere in Portland, a $1 million necklace remained hidden, along with the truth about who had taken it and how they had managed to accomplish what investigators were calling one of the most precisely executed thefts in the city's history. The weeks that followed brought a kind of suffocating silence to the Cascade Grand Hotel, broken only by the persistent questioning of investigators and the whispered conversations of staff members who found themselves looking at familiar faces with new uncertainty. Detective Wells had established a temporary command center in one of the hotel's conference rooms, where boxes of evidence and witness statements created a paper fortress around the central mystery that refused to yield its secrets. Eleanor Blackwood's composure began to show cracks as December arrived with its early darkness and biting cold. The woman who had initially received news of the theft with remarkable grace now spent her mornings staring out at the grey Portland sky, her untouched breakfast growing cold on the table beside her. The financial loss, while significant, paled in comparison to the emotional weight of losing something that had connected her to 3 generations of family history. Her grandmother's voice seemed to echo in the empty spaces where the necklace should have been, reminding Eleanor of stories told in childhood about grand ballrooms and important moments marked by the sparkle of the midnight rose against elegant gowns. The investigation had expanded beyond the hotel's walls, reaching into the personal lives of everyone who had possessed access to the vault. Frederick Caldwell found his 12 years of impeccable service scrutinized with the intensity of an archaeological dig, every decision questioned, every minor discrepancy magnified. His wife, Margaret, noticed how he had begun to wake in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling with the hollow expression of a man watching his reputation dissolve. Their daughter, away at college, called less frequently as news of the investigation reached her campus, and Frederick could hear the uncertainty in her voice when she asked how he was managing the situation. Victoria Hartwell responded to the pressure by becoming almost mechanical in her precision, arriving at work earlier than ever and staying long into the evening, as if perfect performance in the present could somehow erase the questions surrounding the past. Her apartment, always neat, became obsessively organized, every surface gleaming, every document filed with museum-quality care. Friends who tried to invite her out found themselves declined with polite but firm excuses, as Victoria seemed determined to prove her dedication through isolation and tireless work. Marcus Fleming's reaction proved the most difficult to read. The former police officer maintained his professional demeanor with the skill of someone accustomed to being observed and evaluated. Yet colleagues noticed subtle changes. How he would pause sometimes in the middle of conversations, as if listening for something only he could hear, or the way his eyes would follow Detective Wells with the calculating attention of someone trying to stay one step ahead of an opponent's strategy. The first major breakthrough in the case came not from brilliant detective work, but from a simple clerical error that revealed the depth of the hotel's security problems. A maintenance worker, replacing burned-out light fixtures in the basement corridor, discovered a small notebook wedged behind an electrical panel. The notebook contained what appeared to be a record of vault openings that didn't match the official logs, suggesting that someone had been accessing the secure area without following proper protocols for months, possibly years. This discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation and led to the revelation that the hotel's security system was far more porous than anyone had imagined. Additional keys had indeed been made, hidden in various locations throughout the building, and the two-person rule for vault access had been routinely ignored when convenience demanded a more flexible approach. What had seemed like an impossible crime began to look more like the inevitable result of systematic negligence. Detective Wells brought in specialists to examine every aspect of the hotel's security infrastructure, and what they found painted a troubling picture of an organization that had relied more on reputation than actual protection. The cameras that were supposed to monitor the basement had blind spots that could be exploited by someone with knowledge of their positioning. The electronic logs that tracked keycard usage showed signs of tampering, suggesting that someone with technical skills had been covering their tracks for an extended period. The investigation expanded to include background checks that went far deeper than the hotel's original hiring practices had required. This process revealed that Marcus Fleming's departure from the police force, while officially described as voluntary, had actually followed an internal investigation into missing evidence from the property room. No charges had been filed, and Fleming's references had emphasized his technical competence and knowledge of security procedures, but the timing raised uncomfortable questions about the thoroughness of the hotel's vetting process. Victoria Hartwell's history proved equally complex under closer examination. Her rise through the hotel's ranks had been impressive, but investigators discovered that she had access to financial records and vendor relationships that would have made it possible to manipulate the security system's maintenance schedules. More intriguingly, she had previously worked for a jewelry store that had experienced its own mysterious inventory discrepancies, though she had never been considered a suspect in those losses. Frederick Caldwell's management style, which had seemed admirably hands-off, began to look more like willful blindness to problems he should have addressed. The minor inventory discrepancies that investigators had initially noted proved to be part of a larger pattern of missing items, not just from the vault, but from throughout the hotel. Expensive wine from the restaurant, antique furnishings from guest rooms, even artwork from the lobby had disappeared over the years, always in small enough quantities to avoid detection, but significant enough to suggest systematic theft. As winter deepened, the case began to affect the broader Portland community in ways that extended far beyond the hotel itself. The Cascade Grand had been more than just a luxury accommodation. It had been a symbol of the city's aspirations, a place where important business deals were concluded and social hierarchies were maintained. The revelation that this institution's security was fundamentally flawed sent ripples through the circles of wealth and influence that had considered the hotel a safe haven for their most valuable possessions. Eleanor's planned charitable donation became a casualty of the theft, as the children's hospital wing that was to have been funded by the necklace's sale remained an unrealized dream. The hospital's board, who had already begun architectural planning based on Eleanor's commitment, found themselves explaining to donors and the press why the project had been indefinitely postponed. Eleanor herself seemed to age years in a matter of months. The vibrant woman who had stepped from the Bentley replaced by someone who moved through her days with the careful deliberation of someone who no longer trusted the world around her. The media attention that initially focused on the mystery of the theft gradually shifted to criticism of the investigation itself. Detective Wells found himself defending not just his methods, but the competence of the entire Portland Police Department. as local newspapers ran editorials questioning how a crime committed under such controlled circumstances could remain unsolved for so long. The pressure from the mayor's office and the police chief became constant, a reminder that high-profile cases involving wealthy victims carried political consequences that extended far beyond the immediate need for justice. By spring, the investigation had consumed thousands of hours of police time and generated enough paperwork to fill several filing cabinets. Yet the Midnight Rose remained missing, and no arrests had been made. The polygraph examinations that Victoria had volunteered for proved inconclusive, as did similar tests administered to Frederick and Marcus. Each of the three key holders maintained their innocence with varying degrees of conviction, but innocence and truth, Detective Wells had learned over his career, were not always the same thing. The case began to take on the characteristics of an obsession for everyone involved. Detective Wells found himself driving past the hotel at odd hours, as if he might somehow catch sight of a clue that had eluded him during official visits. Eleanor extended her stay month after month, creating a kind of vigil in the hotel lounge where she had become a fixture, reading mystery novels with an irony that was lost on no one who knew her story. The hotel itself began to change in ways that reflected the ongoing uncertainty. Reservations dropped as word of the theft and the investigation's failures spread through the networks of wealthy travelers who had once considered the Cascade Grand their preferred destination. Staff members left for other positions, unwilling to work under the cloud of suspicion that seemed to follow everyone associated with the building. The elegant atmosphere that had defined the hotel for decades gave way to something more tentative and guarded. Frederick Caldwell's position became increasingly precarious as the hotel's owners grew impatient with the negative publicity and declining revenues. By summer, he had been quietly encouraged to take early retirement, officially for health reasons, but understood by everyone to be a response to the security failures that had occurred under his management. His replacement, brought in from a hotel chain that emphasized modern security protocols over traditional elegance, began implementing changes that transformed the Cascade Grand into something more corporate and less personal. Victoria Hartwell's ambitions for advancement died with the investigation's revelations about the hotel's operational problems. Rather than being promoted to manager as she had hoped, she found herself reassigned to administrative duties that kept her away from any position involving security or financial responsibility. The enthusiasm that had once made her a standout employee was replaced by a mechanical competence that fulfilled her duties without the passion that had previously driven her excellence. Marcus Fleming's departure from the hotel came without fanfare or explanation, simply a notice that his position had been eliminated as part of the restructuring that followed Frederick's retirement. Some staff members believed he had been quietly fired, while others thought he had left voluntarily to avoid further scrutiny. His replacement was a former FBI agent whose credentials and background checks were so thorough that they seemed designed to highlight the inadequacy of previous hiring practices. The investigation officially remained open, but by autumn it had been relegated to cold case status, with Detective Wells moving on to more recent crimes that offered better prospects for resolution. The file boxes were moved to storage, and the temporary command center in the hotel was converted back to a conference room where business meetings resumed their normal rhythm. The Midnight Rose had joined the ranks of Portland's unsolved mysteries, a story that would be retold at dinner parties and in newspaper retrospectives for years to come. Eleanor finally left the city in October, exactly 1 year after the theft that had upended her life. The silver Bentley that carried her away from the Cascade Grand moved through streets that had witnessed a full cycle of seasons during her unwanted residence, and those who had come to know her during the investigation found themselves missing the quiet dignity with which she had endured the ordeal. Her departure marked the end of the active phase of the case, though the questions it had raised about trust, security, and human nature continued to resonate long after her departure. Years passed, with the slow accumulation of changes that transform cities and the people who inhabit them. The Cascade Grand adapted to its new identity as a more conventional luxury hotel, successful enough but lacking the unique character that had once made it Portland's crown jewel. Detective Wells retired and was replaced by younger officers who knew the Midnight Rose case only as a cautionary tale about the limitations of even the most thorough investigations. Frederick Caldwell moved to a small coastal town where he managed a bed and breakfast with his wife, finding peace in the simpler rhythms of a business where the most valuable items were handmade quilts and local artwork. Victoria Hartwell eventually left Portland entirely, taking a position with a hotel chain in another state, where her background could be presented as experience rather than liability. Marcus Fleming seemed to disappear entirely from public view, leaving no forwarding address and maintaining no contact with former colleagues. Eleanor Blackwood lived quietly in her family estate, channeling her remaining energy into smaller charitable projects that didn't require the sale of irreplaceable heirlooms. She never spoke publicly about the theft, but those close to her noticed that she wore jewelry less frequently than before, as if the loss of the Midnight Rose had somehow diminished her trust in the permanence of beautiful things. The case might have remained forever unsolved, filed away with other mysteries that time gradually transforms from urgent investigations into historical curiosities. But 15 years after that October morning, when an empty vault compartment had launched one of Portland's most puzzling cases, renovation work at the Cascade Grand uncovered something that changed everything. Workers updating the hotel's electrical system found themselves removing panels and fixtures that hadn't been disturbed since the building's original construction in the 1920s. Behind a false wall in the basement, installed with the kind of craftsmanship that suggested professional knowledge of the building's structure, they discovered a small hidden compartment that contained items that had gone missing from the hotel over a span of many years. Among the recovered items, wrapped in preservation cloth and stored with the care of a museum curator, was a familiar velvet box. Inside, the Midnight Rose sparkled with the same captured starlight that had made it legendary, apparently untouched by its years of concealment. But perhaps more significant than the necklace's recovery was what else the hidden compartment contained. Detailed plans of the hotel's layout, including security camera positions and blind spots, along with duplicate keys and a journal documenting thefts that stretched back over a decade. The discovery sent shockwaves through Portland's law enforcement community and reopened a case that many had assumed would never be solved. Detective Wells, now retired but still sharp, was called in to consult on the new evidence and found himself once again walking the halls of the Cascade Grand, this time with answers to questions that had haunted him for over a decade. The journal revealed a level of systematic theft that far exceeded what the original investigation had uncovered, and the professional manner in which the hiding place had been constructed suggested someone with both technical expertise and intimate knowledge of the building's structure. As investigators began the process of analyzing the recovered evidence with forensic techniques that had advanced significantly since the original case, they found themselves finally possessing the key to a mystery that had seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. The Midnight Rose had been found, but the story of its theft and recovery was about to reveal truths that would prove even more complex and surprising than the original crime had suggested. The journal's pages revealed a story that none of the investigators had anticipated, written in careful handwriting that spoke of methodical planning and profound loneliness. As Detective Wells turned each page in the recovered evidence room, 15 years of questions began to find their answers in the most unexpected way possible. The thefts had indeed begun shortly after the hotel's security system was last upgraded, but the perpetrator wasn't any of the three key holders who had endured years of suspicion. Instead, the journal belonged to Thomas Whitmore, the antique dealer who had been staying at the hotel during Eleanor's visit, but the story it told was far more complex than simple greed or opportunity. Thomas had been a legitimate antique dealer once, building a respected business over 2 decades through honest transactions and genuine expertise in historical objects. His downfall had come not through criminal intent, but through a series of personal tragedies that had slowly eroded both his financial stability and his moral compass. The death of his wife from a prolonged illness had consumed his savings, followed by his daughter's rejection of him when he could no longer afford her college tuition. By the time he began staying at the Cascade Grand, he was barely maintaining the facade of success while facing bankruptcy and complete social isolation. The journal entries revealed a man who had initially intended to stay at the hotel for only a few days while conducting legitimate business. But his expertise in antiques had made him acutely aware of the valuable items that surrounded him in the hotel's public spaces, and his knowledge of building construction from his years of evaluating estate properties had allowed him to recognize the possibilities that the hotel's vintage architecture presented. What had started as desperate opportunism had evolved into something more systematic and troubling. Thomas had spent months studying the hotel's routines, learning the schedules of staff members, and gradually mapping out the building's blind spots and structural vulnerabilities. The small items that had gone missing over the years were taken not for their monetary value alone, but as a way of testing his theories about how undetected theft could be accomplished in such a closely monitored environment. The Midnight Rose represented the culmination of his planning, but also, according to his journal entries, the crime that was supposed to be his last. Thomas had convinced himself that one significant theft would provide enough money to disappear entirely, perhaps to a small town where he could start over with a new identity and the hope of rebuilding his relationship with his daughter. The technical details recorded in the journal showed a level of sophisticated planning that explained why the original investigation had found the crime so baffling. Thomas had spent weeks creating the hidden compartment behind the false wall, working during the early morning hours when the basement level was least likely to be monitored. He had studied the hotel's electrical systems and ventilation patterns to determine the optimal location for concealment, and had even researched the building's original blueprints at the city archives to ensure that his modifications wouldn't be detected during routine maintenance. The duplicate keys had been created through a combination of technical skill and social manipulation that demonstrated both Thomas's intelligence and his growing desperation. By befriending maintenance staff and engaging hotel employees in conversations about the building's history, he had gained access to information about lock specifications and security protocols that should have been confidential. His background in antiques had given him contacts in the metalworking trades who were willing to create duplicate keys without asking uncomfortable questions about their intended use. Perhaps most troubling were the journal entries that revealed Thomas's internal struggle with what he was doing. Far from being a callous criminal, he had documented his guilt and self-loathing with painful honesty, describing sleepless nights spent questioning whether he could go through with increasingly serious thefts. The pages showed a man trying to justify his actions through increasingly elaborate rationalizations, telling himself that insurance would cover the losses and that wealthy guests could afford to lose items that meant nothing to them compared to what they meant to him. The night of the Midnight Rose theft had been the most carefully orchestrated crime in Thomas's campaign of theft, but also the one that had destroyed him emotionally. The journal entries from the days following the theft showed a complete breakdown of his justifications, replaced by overwhelming guilt and the growing realization that he had become something he no longer recognized. Eleanor's quiet dignity in the face of loss had particularly affected him, as he observed her daily presence in the hotel lounge and gradually understood that the necklace represented far more than monetary value. Detective Wells found himself experiencing an unexpected mixture of satisfaction and sadness as he read through the evidence that finally explained the case that had haunted him throughout his career. The technical mystery was solved, but the human dimensions of the crime were more complex than he had imagined. Thomas Whitmore had died 2 years earlier in a small town in Oregon, taking his secrets with him and leaving behind only the hidden compartment that renovation work had finally uncovered. The discovery of Thomas's true identity required investigators to piece together his movements during the months following the theft. Hotel records showed that he had checked out the day after Eleanor discovered her necklace was missing, claiming urgent business in California. But financial records and witness statements painted a picture of a man who had been unable to find peace with what he had done, moving from town to town and using different names, while the stolen necklace remained hidden in the Cascade Grand's walls. Thomas had apparently made several attempts to return the necklace anonymously, but his fear of prosecution and the complexity of explaining how he could possess such an item without implicating himself in the theft had paralyzed his efforts at redemption. The journal's final entries, written in an increasingly shaky hand, spoke of his desire to somehow make amends for the pain he had caused Eleanor, but also his inability to find a way to do so without destroying what remained of his life. The revelation of Thomas's identity and methods brought a mixture of relief and renewed pain to those who had lived under suspicion for 15 years. Frederick Caldwell received the news at his coastal bed and breakfast, where the phone call from Detective Wells interrupted a quiet morning of preparing breakfast for guests who appreciated his careful attention to detail and genuine warmth. The vindication was welcome, but it couldn't restore the career that had been cut short or repair the relationships that had been strained by years of uncertainty. Victoria Hartwell had built a successful new life, managing a boutique hotel in Santa Barbara, where her meticulous attention to detail was appreciated without the shadow of suspicion that had followed her in Portland. When Detective Wells reached her with news of the case's resolution, she listened in silence before asking the question that had haunted her for years. Why had Thomas chosen to let innocent people suffer for his crimes? The answer, Wells admitted, might never be fully understood, but the journal suggested that Thomas had been as trapped by his actions as those who had been wrongly suspected. Marcus Fleming proved more difficult to locate, having moved frequently since leaving Portland and maintaining minimal contact with former colleagues. When investigators finally reached him at a small security consulting firm in Montana, his reaction was characteristically controlled, though those who knew him well might have detected relief beneath his professional demeanor. He had built a quiet life, installing security systems for rural businesses, finding satisfaction in honest work that helped people protect what mattered to them. Eleanor Blackwood, now 77 and living quietly on her family estate, received the news of the necklace's recovery with the same composure she had shown throughout the original ordeal. Detective Wells made the journey to her home personally, carrying the familiar velvet box that had been at the center of so much anguish. When Eleanor opened the box and saw the midnight rose sparkling in the afternoon sunlight streaming through her library windows, her first words were not about her own vindication, but about the tragedy of a man who had destroyed himself through choices that seemed to offer salvation, but delivered only deeper despair. The legal proceedings that followed the case's resolution were necessarily complex, as the statute of limitations had expired for most of Thomas's crimes, and the primary perpetrator was beyond the reach of earthly justice. The recovered items were returned to their rightful owners or their estates. Insurance settlements were adjusted, and official reports were filed that finally closed the books on one of Portland's most perplexing unsolved cases. But the true resolution of the case came not in courtrooms or police stations, but in the quiet moments when individuals who had carried the burden of suspicion for 15 years finally felt free to move forward without the weight of unresolved questions. The Cascade Grand itself underwent another renovation. This one designed not just to update its facilities, but to restore some of the character that had been lost during the years of uncertainty and corporate management. Eleanor made an unexpected decision regarding the recovered necklace. Rather than selling it, as she had originally planned, she chose to donate it to the Portland Art Museum, where it would be displayed as part of an exhibition about the city's history and the stories that connected past and present. The museum's curator noted that Eleanor's gift came with an unusual request, that the display include information about Thomas Whitmore's expertise in antiques and his earlier contributions to the field, recognizing the complexity of human nature that allowed someone to be both knowledgeable about beauty and capable of stealing it from others. The Children's Hospital wing, that had been delayed by the theft, finally received funding through Eleanor's estate planning, ensuring that her charitable intentions would eventually be fulfilled, even if not in the manner she had originally envisioned. The wing's dedication ceremony included a small plaque acknowledging not only Eleanor's generosity, but also the 15-year journey that had tested the community's faith in justice and redemption. Detective Wells found himself returning to the Cascade Grand one final time, not as an investigator, but as a guest celebrating his granddaughter's college graduation. The hotel had indeed changed, but it retained enough of its original character to evoke memories of the young detective who had first walked through its marble lobby in search of answers to impossible questions. As he sat in the lounge where Eleanor had maintained her patient vigil, he reflected on the lessons that the case had taught him about the complexity of truth and the importance of persistence in the face of seemingly insurmountable mysteries. The case of the Midnight Rose became part of the curriculum at the police academy, used not only to teach investigative techniques, but also to illustrate the human dimensions of crime that extend far beyond the immediate act of theft. Young detectives learned about the importance of considering all possibilities, the danger of assuming that the most obvious suspects are always guilty, and the reality that some cases require patience measured in decades rather than months. Victoria Hartwell eventually returned to Portland for the museum exhibition featuring the Midnight Rose, her first visit to the city since leaving 15 years earlier. Standing before the necklace in its climate-controlled display case, she found herself thinking not about the suspicion and uncertainty that had driven her away, but about the lessons she had learned about resilience and the possibility of rebuilding a life even after it seemed irreparably damaged. Frederick Caldwell lived to see his reputation officially restored, though he took greater satisfaction in the success of his small coastal inn than in any vindication the Whitmore revelation provided. His approach to hospitality had been fundamentally changed by his experience at the Cascade Grand, becoming more personal and less focused on the external trappings of luxury. Guests often commented on the genuine warmth of his service and the obvious pleasure he took in ensuring their comfort and security. The story of Thomas Whitmore himself became a subject of discussion among criminologists and psychologists, interested in understanding how ordinary people can be led to extraordinary crimes through a combination of desperation and rationalization. His journal provided insights into the mental processes that allow intelligent, previously honest individuals to convince themselves that theft is justified by circumstances, while simultaneously documenting the psychological toll that such self-deception ultimately exacts. Years passed, and the Midnight Rose case gradually took its place among the solved mysteries that contribute to a community's shared history. The necklace continued to attract visitors to the Portland Art Museum, many of them drawn not only by its beauty, but by the story of loss, investigation, and eventual resolution that had made it famous. Museum guides noted that visitors often spent more time reading about the case than examining the necklace itself, suggesting that the human drama was ultimately more compelling than even the most spectacular jewelry. Eleanor Blackwood passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 82, surrounded by family members who had watched her transform a personal tragedy into an opportunity for education and generosity. Her funeral was attended by Detective Wells, now retired but still sharp, who spoke about the grace and patience she had shown during the darkest period of the investigation. The service included readings from letters she had written to the families of other crime victims, offering support and encouragement drawn from her own experience of loss and eventual resolution. The Cascade Grand continued to operate as a luxury hotel, its reputation fully restored and its security systems updated with technology that would have seemed impossible during the original investigation. Staff members occasionally shared stories about the famous case with interested guests, usually emphasizing the lessons learned about the importance of proper procedures and the unexpected ways that truth can emerge even after years of concealment. Marcus Fleming eventually established a successful security consulting business that specialized in helping small businesses and institutions protect their valuable assets. His experience with the Cascade Grand case, initially a source of professional embarrassment, became valuable expertise that allowed him to identify vulnerabilities that others might miss. He never spoke publicly about his time under suspicion, but colleagues noticed his particular compassion for employees who found themselves questioned in the aftermath of thefts or other security breaches. Detective Wells spent his retirement years writing a book about unsolved cases, including a chapter about the Midnight Rose that emphasized the importance of patience and thorough investigation even when immediate results seem impossible. He often spoke at law enforcement conferences about the case, using it to illustrate how advances in technology and changes in circumstances can sometimes provide answers to questions that once seemed permanently unanswerable. The hidden compartment where Thomas had concealed his stolen treasures was preserved during the hotel's renovation, converted into a small display area that told the story of the case and its resolution. Hotel guests could view the space where the Midnight Rose had waited 15 years for discovery, and many found themselves moved by the proximity to a mystery that had captured the city's imagination for so long. As Portland continued to grow and change, the story of the Midnight Rose became part of the city's folklore, told and retold in ways that emphasized different aspects of its significance. Some versions focused on the detective work that eventually solved the case, others on the human tragedy of Thomas Whitmore's moral collapse, and still others on Eleanor Blackwood's remarkable dignity in the face of loss and uncertainty. The case's ultimate resolution provided a kind of closure that extended beyond the immediate participants to touch anyone who had followed the story or been affected by its implications about trust, security, and justice. The revelation that the truth had been hidden, not by sophisticated criminal organization, but by one desperate man's inability to face the consequences of his actions, offered both comfort and caution about the complexity of human nature and the unpredictable paths that lead people toward both crime and redemption. In the end, the Midnight Rose returned to its role as a thing of beauty, displayed where it could be appreciated by visitors who might never know its full story. But for those who remembered the years of uncertainty and investigation, the necklace represented something more complex and ultimately more valuable than its monetary worth. It stood as a symbol of patience rewarded, truth eventually revealed, and the possibility that even the most challenging mysteries might someday yield their secrets to those willing to persist in seeking answers. The story reminded Portland and its people that justice, while sometimes delayed, could still be achieved through careful investigation, community support, and the kind of faith in eventual resolution that Eleanor Blackwood had demonstrated throughout her long ordeal. The Midnight Rose sparkled on in its museum case, catching light from countless visitors who came to witness not just a beautiful object, but a testament to the enduring human capacity for both falling into darkness and finding a way back to the light.